Okay, we're going to be talking now about the demo portion of this presentation and how we conquer communication challenges in the assembly process instructions. So, the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about a company, Aaron's Controls. They came with a couple of needs. They wanted to be able to reduce the time it takes to develop their product documentation. They wanted to reduce the amount of time it takes to implement engineering changes into their existing documentation process, and they wanted to increase the overall quality of their assembly instructions. If you look at their current process, it was a very manual process using digital photographs that were manually integrated into a text document, and the process was time consuming, and most importantly, it was done completely at the end of the product development cycle. So this is quotes from Joseph Stefanski, the engineering services manager, and you can see that's the big challenge for them is that they're not even able to start working on their product documentation until the end of the product documentation cycle when they already have physical parts to be able to photograph, right? So what we want to do is now look at how can we go through this process in a way that is more concurrent and more efficient than what they're doing today. So we're going to be talking about creating manufacturing instructions for a specific process related to this device you see here. It's a satellite receiver. And we're going to be talking about a procedure to install these fans as one of the last steps in the assembly process. So this would be like one specific work order or whatever you want to call it, but this is basically a set of instructions around installing these fans using these components. So we're going to walk through 4 basic steps in this process. We're going to talk about actually developing the content for one of these documents. We're going to talk about more specifically creating parts lists. Then we're going to talk about how we'd actually go about implementing changes as design changes happen. How do we implement those changes into our product documentation? And then ultimately we're going to take a look at where you can kind of go beyond this, right? So looking at interactive content and animation, some of the other things, sort of that you could look to off in the future after implementing this type of a tool for creating your documentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is just document development, okay? So let's jump into the software. Okay, so here is SOLIDWORKS Composer, and what I've got here is I've got this 3D model that was created by an engineer inside of SOLIDWORKS, and then I've taken that 3D model from SOLIDWORKS and opened it here inside of SOLIDWORKS Composer. So here in Composer I have the geometry, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating images. So I've got one here already created. This is my first image. Now Composer doesn't really distinguish between 2D and 3D, right? Like, so I have just the 3D model. I'm going to create an image. I have this image here. This is my 2D image, right? So I've got all these different tools inside of Composer. For example, I want to create maybe this nice little view here where I'm going to zoom in and out. Maybe I'm going to show kind of the first step in a process of removing this LCD screen, for example. So I've got here, I'm going to show this detail view. I could do that. Another thing I might want to do is I might want to do something a little bit more interesting, like maybe like an X-ray style view, so I can sort of pull layers away and say, okay, we're going to be focused on removing this screen here. So again, I can just kind of freeze that. I can move this around now. I can come in, I can maybe drop in some text. So I'll say, okay, I'm going to create some text that says remove LCD screen, and now I've got a pretty nice looking image. I can lay it out into a specific image size if I want now, so you can see I sort of have this image frame that I'm looking at. That looks pretty nice. Again, I can just snap that. I can snap this picture, and now if I go back to any previously created image and then I come back to here, you can see it remembers everything exactly as I had left it. Right? So we'll turn that preview off. So again, now that's one way to just kind of start creating these kind of basic images, right? Another thing that we do a lot in Composer is showing how assemblies are either taken apart or put together. So here inside of Composer, it's very easy to manipulate geometry. So I can just grab parts and I can just start dragging things and snapping views. Maybe I want to hide something. Again, I can just create these views really easily. Maybe I even want to come in and grab a whole bunch of parts. Maybe we're going to also be removing some other circuit boards here. You can just sort of grab everything. and drag it out. So I'll just grab all these parts, for example. This looks pretty nice. You can just see how easy it is to just take some geometry, move it, maybe use some of our other tools like this explode tools, sort of just blow everything apart, just keep taking these snapshots, and it's really easy to sort of build up this sequence of views. So you can see now I've actually just created this whole process of removing the lid, starting even from the beginning. We have this, we've removed the lid, and pulled this circuit board out, etc. Right? It's pretty easy to just create this sequence of images. The next thing we might want to do is come into the front, and we'll go ahead and just grab all these front parts. Maybe we are talking about removing this LCD screen, right? So again, I'm just going to grab all these parts in the front, and we'll just explode it all out, right? So it's really just that easy to take these parts and move everything around. Another thing I might want to do is, maybe I want to take these screws. I can just come in and move things around specifically. So I can take this, move it out, move things around. It's really just all about like how do you want to show things. Another thing you might want to have done is you might want to move some of these other parts around. So maybe I want to show this LCD screen out up here as well. Again, I can just take this part and say I want to move it essentially the same as I moved the screws. So then again, I could take this part too maybe, and I can just copy it up there as if all those parts had moved together. And then now, if I take this thing, and again, I can just create a new explode from here. So again, it's just really all about, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is just simply that you're not constrained to creating explode views in a very linear thought process, whereas in a CAD tool, sometimes it's more challenging in the sense that you have to kind of know where you want to get to before you get started, and you have to do everything in a very specific order. Here it's very order independent. I've just created this whole big explode view, and I can just come back in and manipulate geometry however I want to, and then I get to the end result, which is a view that is exactly what I was looking for. I can come in and add in little details like maybe some paths, and then once we've done that, we can manipulate these. And so everything in Composer has the ability to very easily change its properties. Maybe we want to change the width of that path. Maybe we want to make it not just a direct. Maybe we want to make it kind of go in more of a traditional looking explode style. So something like that looks pretty good. Maybe I want to grab those guys again. We can also turn on, we got these tips, right? So we can get rid of that. And these are just all the different types of options that you have to quickly create pretty nice looking sort of complex view, right? So now I can really see exactly where that LCD screen fits into this whole process and how it's going to be screwed in, right? And again, all I have to do is hit this button, snap a view, and now I've built up my whole sequence of the different steps for a given procedure, right? And if we take a look now, so this is just kind of building something up from scratch. The thing that we're going to be talking about today specifically is the installation of these fans, right? So you can see I've got a document here already prepared with these steps in it. So again, same process. I'm just hiding geometry, pulling it apart, displaying what I want, and then using this concept of snapping images to create this sequence that shows exactly what I want. And I've got this built into a Word document. So here is a Word document with all of those images that I just showed you inserted into it. So here we can see that I created these images inside a Composer and then just simply inserted them into this Word document. And that is basically the process. You just build up these images, and then we'll talk about it in a little bit. We'll talk about how we export it, but basically what we do is we export these out and then insert them into a Word document. So the idea is it allows you to quickly create all of these views and being able to define these complex workflows using a tool to just quickly start pulling geometry apart and create your entire sequence. So let's look at another idea, which is this idea of creating parts lists. So parts list is something that is very common when we're talking about a specific step in a procedure, right? So maybe this is there's a kit for a specific step in a process, right? So as opposed to in engineering terms or software or whatever, when we have something where we more like call a bill of materials for the entire assembly, in some cases what we want is something like this, right? Where it's like, okay, these are just the specific parts that I'm going to need for this step, right? So how do we do something like that in a traditional CAD package? It'd be very time consuming. For those of you guys who've used CAD before, you would know that creating a view like that is very tricky, and different parts might be in different sub-assemblies, and just lining things up and moving things around, it's just very challenging to do with a traditional assembly structure. So let me take you through how to create a view like that using SOLIDWORKS Composer. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to start selecting things, hiding them. It's really easy to just take all these parts and just sort of hide what I don't want. I'm not worried about what level of the assembly or any of these things at. I'm just trying to drive in and get rid of the specific parts that I don't need, right? So now I've kind of just very quickly isolated just the components I need. And again, SOLIDWORKS Composer is really focused on this idea of assembly, right? So whether it's assembling something, disassembling something, showing how something is serviced or goes together, there's all these tools in here, and I'm only going to touch on a few of these, but there's all these very specific tools to help you with those processes. For example, I really like this tool we have called Cylindrical Explode, right? So it allows me to just take all these parts and just move them together as though, imagine an imaginary pipe being in there and growing or shrinking in diameter and how they respond to that, right? Or I can come in and just directly manipulate and move parts, right? So I'll just move these guys right in line. And again, for the purposes of documentations, a lot of times it's not as necessary to make sure everything is super exact, right? It's just about how does it look, right? So again, I can just take these things, kind of line them up, get it looking pretty good. Maybe want to line this up pretty nicely, whatever. And then we can come in, grab these parts. Maybe I'll rotate these bolts around. So you have a nice looking view there of those like you saw before. So that's pretty cool. But what about these ones? Now, so I also want to show the screws that are going to be used to install the fan. Again, it's just all about quickly being able to select and manipulate geometry. So again, I'll just take all these bolts, I'll move them up. I want to bring them close together. Another good place to use my Cylindrical Explode tools to, again, just kind of easily move everything together, bring everything close together, and then now I want to rotate them. Well, what happens if I grab all this stuff and rotate it? That's not necessarily what I want. If I grab the axis here, I could do it like this, and then I could probably rotate these things around and move it. But again, like I said, everything in Composer, there's all these very specific tools to help you easily manipulate and move geometry around, right? So I'm going to say that I actually just want to move everything in sort of its own local coordinate system, right? That's pretty nice. Now I can just take all these bolts, move them 90 degrees with respect to themselves, and now I've got it looking just how I want it, right? The next thing I might want to do, maybe I'm a total perfectionist and I want to just have everything all nicely lined up. So we've also got some really nice tools for alignment. So for example, if I just want to do, there's no concept of mates here per se. What I want to do is I want to come in and I want to say I just want to align those screws to that face. And again, I'm going to align these screws here. So again, I can just pick a couple faces. This is really just being somewhat of a perfectionist, but sometimes it's really what you want. You want to make things look really good. We've got all the nice tools in here, but you're not worried about some kind of complex overhead of mates where, in the real assembly, now this mate might impact something else and you're trying to manage configurations or something else like that. Now we've got this looking just how we want. I can come into an exact view. For example, maybe I want to come in exactly around and look just head on how I want. You can go to orthogonal views, just like you would in a regular CAD type tool. Another thing I might want to do is I might want to take this thing and I might want to go to more of a traditional looking technical illustration style rendering. So we'll go black and white. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, now I want to create a parts list. So don't think of a bill of materials, think of a parts list. This is the list of the parts that pertain to the current step. So I'm going to generate callouts and a table for this specific view, right? So I've got the descriptions of my 2 screws and my fan, their part numbers, and then the quantities that pertain to what I have on the screen right now. I've also got a lot of options here for manipulating these callouts. For example, maybe I want to put everything over to the right. Maybe I just want to let myself be able to drag it, so I can drag these things around. I can adjust all kinds of different things. Very specific. I can adjust line weights. I can adjust the tips. Maybe I want to show an arrow style tip. Maybe just a regular, this kind of an arrow. And again, it's really easy. Now you see how easy it was for me to just create this type of a view. Whereas, like I say, this type of a thing to create in sometimes a more traditional quote-unquote CAD package, it would be a little bit more challenging. Sometimes other little things too. Maybe I've got these balloons kind of all over the place. We've got another nice little tool here called a magnet line. You might have actually seen this in SolidWorks if you're a SolidWorks user. And I can take this again. I can just grab a bunch of these balloons and just kind of drag this around, kind of give it a cool look. And now I've created this image and it looks pretty good. And again, all I have to do now is just hit my snapshot button and that is frozen now. I can go back to any one of these other views and you can see when I come back, it remembers, the exact position of all the parts, what's hidden, what's shown. It remembers that I have this table of just these parts, these callouts, and I have my parts list or my kit view for this specific procedure, right? So if we jump back into this, we can see, the idea is that you're able to rapidly generate these on-the-fly parts lists that just pertain to a given step. Maybe lots of times you want to show, you have a list of the parts for each step, and each step needs a different parts list with different BOM IDs and different callouts. It's really easy to just sort of generate this on the fly rather than trying to manipulate some full BOM complex tables. The other thing is like very easy to intuitively control geometry. Like you saw, it's very easy for me to go in, grab all these parts, move things around, and just start aligning things and pulling things apart and pushing them together in ways that is very much more intuitive and easy to get through than it is in a more traditional CAD package. So the next thing to talk about is implementing change, right? So what happens when it comes time, you created this whole document and now engineers come back, they've made a change. In this case, we've run some flow analysis. It turns out that those top vents that you saw in the geometry actually create worse airflow condition than if they weren't there at all, right? So we run some flow analysis with the top vents in there. You can see all this dead air in this back space. We're not getting good air movement. And we run a couple of scenarios where we have a couple of different vents, and then we run another one where there's no vents in the top. And turns out that by having no vents in the top lid, you actually end up with better cooling profile inside the thing. So engineers say, no more vents. We're going with a new design that has no vents. Well, as the documentation goes, this is now going to be somewhat of a problem, right? You have all these images that you created. Imagine if you'd done this with digital photography. All the images that you've created don't really look like your product anymore. Functionally, the instruction manual is basically the same. It's just that you don't really want to go and deliver an instruction manual with a picture of the satellite receiver with all these vents in it when the one that you're shipping doesn't have the vents, right? So how do we deal with that? What are we going to do? What's the old process, right? Well, the old process is I got to wait till the new parts come in and I got to reshoot probably half my pictures that show the cover in them, and that's a big process. Well, here inside of SolidWorks Composer, it's a lot easier than that, right? So if I'm looking at this geometry, right, so we've got our remember, we've got this geometry, and all these views are really sort of snapshots in 3D space of this geometry. So what happens, right? Well, now I'm just going to say, well, I want to update this. The engineer has updated the 3D CAD, right? So the engineer has already updated the 3D CAD. He makes the design change in SOLIDWORKS. Here in Composer, I'm able to just update my geometry based on the latest CAD files. So you have this sort of continuous flow from CAD into Composer, create the views, and then ultimately we're going to downstream that into a Word document that I'll show you in a second here. But right now, I've basically pointed at the latest CAD files, and you can see now that it's got no vents in this lid, and so now all of my images here on the left are now going to be up to date. Look at this. So I go into these different views, and you can see now because the views are not some static thing, these views are views of the actual 3D geometry. All the views are up to date with the latest geometry and this no vents style lid. So now what do I do, right? Now all I have to do is come in and say, I want to take all these views that we've created, and I'm going to save them out, and I'm going to overwrite the existing images. So I'm going to say I want to overwrite the images that I have already created. In this case, you can see these are all the images on my hard drive. They're just a bunch of JPEGs. So just making it really easy to still use Microsoft Word or any other publishing tools. We're still going to work with your standard JPEG type images. And what I've done is I've just overwritten the images on my hard drive. And now when I go ahead and open this up, you can see that my Word document is now up to date with images using Microsoft linking tools. You can see that these are now up to date with images that show no vents, right? So now my Word document is up to date based on a geometry change that a SOLIDWORKS engineer made, right? So the idea is that you have this integration with the CAD where engineers make a change in SOLIDWORKS, you pass this through Composer, updates the images. Now your Word documents or any other downstream documentation is going to be up to date, right? This massively reduces the amount of time for rework. Imagine the time savings when geometry changes come through, being able to instantaneously update your documentation like that. It's really going to reduce the amount of time and effort required to do this, right? So this is pretty much the bulk of what we want to talk about here, which is, going through this process of creating the document. Well, the thing about SOLIDWORKS Composer is that it really does also open up a lot of other capabilities, right? And this is what I'm going to call interactive content. So Composer is going to be able to integrate into your current process of just simply creating images to be used in your traditional 2D printed, paper work instructions, right? But there is sort of this other vision on the horizon, right, too, which is that we are going to open up some capabilities if you do want to start sort of taking it to that next level of creating what I'll call interactive content. And this kind of starts with creating animations. Okay, so what we've got here is, remember, this is that original one that I set of views that I just kind of thrown together, starting from sort of an empty document and just sort of pulled some things apart to create these views. Well, the thing that's really nice inside of Composer is that when you do want to go to this point where you're creating animations and other interactive content, if you've already laid out these 2D views, this is really almost like the storyboard for what you're going to be doing later. And it really is kind of the foundation for creating the animations in the first place, right? So watch this. I can just take these views that I had already done. Remember, I had this view, for example, of the lid coming off, right? Well, if I go into my animation, this is a timeline. So imagine, this is a timeline, and now I've got this storyboard. And I just basically want to say at what time in this timeline, in this case maybe at 1.5 seconds, I want to have the lid come off, and then I'm going to have the lid hide itself. And then we'll bring the circuit board up. And again, all I have to do is just take these views, drag them down onto the timeline, and the software is going to interpolate in between the views to create an animation for me. So it's the concept is what we call keyframe animation. And what that means is that you basically just set these quote-unquote keys, and then watch this. So all I had to do was take the views that we'd already created, lay them down onto the timeline, and now in a matter of, maybe 10 seconds, I'm able to create this entire animation of this thing coming apart, right? So think about how easy that is to start laying down an animation. And then, what if you want to kind of go beyond that, right? So again, remember this is the document that I've already been working on and kind of already created some things. So here we've got an animation already created where it took a little bit more time, did a little bit more camera manipulation and whatnot, but the process is the same. Again, you're just dragging the views down onto the timeline, rotating things around, and then using some of the other effects. Remember, that was the digger that I showed you at the beginning, and you're able to very quickly create an animation of the process, right? So today you're going to look at using the software to just replace this sort of image creation process that you have. But like I said, this is something to think of down the line. Maybe you need to communicate to your customers or other external service people some processes, and you want to give them a much more detailed explanation of how something comes together or goes apart. So rather than just creating a bunch of sequences of images, you could actually use the same software to create something like this with an animation. So even beyond that, this last section here is just really to give you sort of a taste of what else is possible with this software. Here's another example. So I'm back in my PowerPoint presentation, right? This is the same PowerPoint that I've been going through this whole time to kind of give you sort of a roadmap of where we're going inside as I go through this demonstration. And here I've actually taken that content from Composer and embedded it into the PowerPoint itself. So we've got customers who have touch screens on a manufacturing floor, and they've implemented an entire process where an operator through a web page or whatever, in this case I'm using PowerPoint, is able to go through a process based on content created in Composer. And again, you're seeing I'm just clicking through the steps in a process, but I actually have the 3D geometry at any point to reference to look at, right? So I'm looking at either these views. I can even embed the animation in it, so you can see here I've got the animation that I created there about installing the fans. All this stuff can be embedded here into presentations or web pages or whatever container it is that you want, using for sales or all these other areas inside the company. And I know we really wanted to focus today specifically on manufacturing instructions, and that's really what we've been talking about most of this time. But again, I just wanted to kind of also give you this quick taste of what else is sort of possible with this software. And that's really sort of, as you get more and more comfortable and you start building up these images, you're going to be able to use those images to take it to that next level, to create animations, do 3D design reviews, and all these other things. That next leap isn't even that far once you've already created the 2D images, which is what you would be doing immediately. So if you just kind of take a step back and look at what we've done so far, we talked about how to actually develop one of these documents, how to quickly create this whole sequence of views. I created like 10, 15 images in a matter of a couple of minutes to define a complex workflow, right? Then we can rapidly generate these on-the-fly parts lists, and you saw all the geometry manipulation that was required to get to that point where I had the fans and the screws and the parts list and everything else, and how quick and easy it was to do that. Then once we've created this whole document, what happens when the engineering data changes, right? So we had a design change, we had to replace the lid. You saw how the CAD integration takes that 3D geometry, instantly updates all of my images, all of my views, and then we can update the images on the hard drive, updates the Word document. You really have this end-to-end integration to massively reduce the amount of time it takes to rework a document. And then finally, we looked at some of the sort of other things that we can do with this software in terms of creating animations and other interactive content and kind of taking it to that next level, right? Well, what does all of this mean? This is really going to help you to massively reduce the amount of errors, right? So just knowing that you're working to the latest revisions of the parts at all times. And then at the end of the day, what's the most important thing? It's going to help you get to market faster because of how much quicker and easier it is to create this content, as well as the fact that you can start working on these documents before you've even gotten any prototypes, right? Well, engineering is still creating the solid models. You can start working on documentation, right? So let's take a look at our friends here from Aaron's Controls again. Remember, we have some interview. We have a case study that we can provide to you. Going through this in more detail, but basically these guys had a couple of goals, right? One was to reduce the time it took them to create their documentation, and they had some pretty stunning results, right? They were able to have their instructions done before the first parts arrived on their dock, and they saw a 66% reduction in the time it took them to create the documentation for assembling their product that they did, this T79XXX. They also wanted to reduce the amount of time it took to implement engineering changes, right? So the quote again from, these are quotes directly from Joseph, which is that the engineers can develop better assembly documentation and they're much more capable to respond to engineering change orders promptly, right? It's very important. And then finally, they wanted to increase the overall quality of their assembly instructions, and they were able to not only put together better content in a fraction of the usual time, there was also no need to wait for production components to arrive. So they're able to create a much higher quality document while also doing it in a much quicker time frame. So with that, thank you guys very much, and we hope you've enjoyed this presentation.